My brothers and sisters, Yali Madad, I hope you all are staying safe and healthy. Today, I want to focus on providing an update on Jamaat Khana reopenings. As I had mentioned previously, we have been reviewing the status of each Jamaat Khana on an almost daily basis to assess when we can safely reopen. The key points that we have been considering are 1. Compliance with directives from government and public health authorities regarding places of worship. 2. The Jamaat's safety. This means that we have been looking at prevalence and trends of new COVID cases in each state and where available, also each county in which a Jamaat Khana is located. And 3. The ability to maintain Jamaat Khana operations appropriately as we did pre-COVID-19 with some temporary modifications to the conduct of ceremonies. The Jamaat may recall that I had previously mentioned that reopenings may not be simultaneous across the United States or even within a region. Given the different impact of this virus across our country, it is possible for certain Jamaat Khanas to reopen before others, even within the same region. On the basis of the above criteria, with humble shukrana, I am pleased to share that this weekend we were able to reopen the first few Jamaat Khanas in the United States. We are hoping to be able to reopen a few more Jamaat Khanas this month, depending on our continued evaluation of various considerations, including those that I just outlined. While we are excited at the opportunity to reopen some Jamaat Khanas, I want to emphasize that the Jamaat should expect their experience in Jamaat Khana to be different than the last time they attended before closure due to the COVID pandemic. For those of us whose local Jamaat Khanas are not reopening at this time or in the coming days, it is vital that each of us take individual responsibility and play our part in protecting our brothers and sisters whose local Jamaat Khanas are reopening. Our ability to reopen Jamaat Khanas anywhere and to keep them open is entirely dependent on all of us in the US Jamaat taking collective responsibility for the Jamaat's well-being and safety. I will take this opportunity to share some important guidelines which will apply to all of us as Jamaat Khanas begin to reopen. First and foremost, only Jamaati members who normally attend a reopening Jamaat Khana should attend that Jamaat Khana when it is reopened. That means that no one should travel from out of town or otherwise try to attend a Jamaat Khana that has been reopened if it is not their regular Jamaat Khana. This is critically important as space arrangements, including physical distancing measures, have only been made for the Jamaat that normally attends the reopened Jamaat Khana. So the single most important thing that each of us can do to keep our entire Jamaat safe is to wait for our own local Jamaat Khana to reopen and not try and attend any other reopening Jamaat Khana. Not on festival days, not on regular days, not at all. I humbly ask for the entire USA Jamaat's cooperation with this request. Second, reopened Jamaat Khanas will operate at a reduced capacity, which will vary by facility due to physical distancing requirements. Access to a reopened Jamaat Khana will be based on a registration system accessible through the Ismaili app. Attendance each day will be limited only to those who have registered and are confirmed to attend. The registration process is necessary to ensure that all Jamaati members of a particular reopened Jamaat Khana have an opportunity to attend as equitably as possible while we comply with the necessary capacity and space restrictions. Third, we respectfully ask all members of the Jamaat who belong to high-risk groups, namely those over 65 or those with serious and compromised health problems, and members of their household to give careful consideration in deciding to attend Jamaat Khana. Also, please do not attend Jamaat Khana if you do not feel well or if you have been in contact with anyone infected or suspected of being infected with COVID in the past 14 days. Fourth, Jamaat Khana attendance will require compliance with various new measures, such as participating in a contactless health and wellness check at the entrance, wearing a mask at all times, ensuring physical distancing, sitting in designated spots, and not socializing at the conclusion of Jamaat Khana, but instead promptly exiting the Jamaat Khana building and premises. Jamaati volunteers have gone through special training to plan for reopenings safely during this pandemic. The Jamaat's cooperation with all volunteer directions is greatly appreciated and very important to ensure a safe experience for everyone. The information I have just provided, along with other information regarding reopenings and the most updated list of Jamaat Khana reopenings, are all available on the.ismaili/USA/reopening. Please continue to visit this webpage as it will continue to be updated as we progress with current and future reopenings. You can also contact the access number with any questions. In the end, I again want to underscore that our ability to reopen and keep open any Jamaat Khana is dependent on the full support and cooperation of every Jamaati member. So I humbly ask for your partnership in this regard. Let us extend our shukrana for the blessing of the reopening of the first few Jamaat Khanas in the United States. We also look forward to updating the Jamaat regarding additional reopenings, inshallah, in due course. Until next time, I wish you and your family the best of health and happiness. Please remember to continue to practice physical distancing, use face coverings, and maintain best of hygiene.
We are very excited to have Dr. Mohammad Kishabji join us today, live from London. Thank you for doing this. So late for you. Dr. Kishabji, a barrister at law with a doctorate from London University on Islam and alternate dispute resolution, is an international cross-cultural mediation specialist. In 2016, he was the recipient of the prestigious Gandhi, King, and Ikeda Prince Peace Award, the highest civilian peace award in the USA, for his work on peace and human rights education. He is an author, lawyer, and mediation trainer who has attended training programs at Harvard Law School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Child Focus in Brussels, and the Berghoff Foundation in Berlin. Dr. Kishabji worked at Maulana Haj Imam's Secretariat in France for over 30 years. Since 2010, he has been based in the UK, where he lectures on law and where he has written 4 books, including one on short stories entitled Diasporic Distractions. Dr. Kishabji is presently working on a new book, Rethinking Islamic Law for the 20th Century, which he is co-authoring with noted political sociologist Hadi Inayat. A former member of the steering committee of the World Mediation Forum and the Darwin International Institute for the Study of Compassion, he is presently a member on the panel of advisors to the Secretary General of the International Social Service of Geneva. He lives in London with his wife, Professor Amina Jindani, a leading international specialist on tuberculosis research. Welcome, Dr. Kishabji. So before we get started with our conversation, I'd like to play a small video that will allow us to sort of set the frame for tonight, if that's okay.
I will not leave this compartment. Where does it say reserved for Europeans only? Please show me.
Get off my train.
In the luggage van. That's for you.
Get down here! Stop the coach!
Has it mattered that he's a Parsi and you are a Muslim and I a Hindu? Why should it matter whether they are Christians or that they speak Tamil or Telugu? We have come here today to get rid of our dog collars, to burn these certificates of our humiliations.
You and your families will be protected.
We don't need your protection. All we want is that you put an end to racial discrimination. We refuse to be treated as outcasts because of the color of our skin. What? But if you value your dignity and your freedom, then come, march with me.
Mandela became South Africa's first democratically elected president in 1994. It was the official end of white minority rule, otherwise known as apartheid. Apartheid, you've heard of it, but what exactly was it? I'm Francesca Fiorentini, and this is AJ Plus. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word that means separateness. It was a system of racial segregation that governed South Africa for nearly 50 years. It specifically aimed to protect the domination of the white South Africans over non-whites in every aspect of life. But it didn't just appear out of thin air. During the colonial grab for the country between the Dutch-descended Afrikaners and the British, the rights of native black South Africans were sidelined. So when apartheid was officially made law in 1948 by the Afrikaner-led National Party, it was a continuation of injustices already happening. Afrikaners believed that South Africa was their God-given homeland, and that the white race was superior. The black majority was therefore seen as a threat. There were 148 apartheid laws. Blacks had to carry ID permits at all times and had to obey strict curfews. Public facilities were separated for white and non-white use, and marriages between whites and other races were banned. People were classified into 4 racial categories: white, black, Indian, and colored. People of mixed race. And they were all separated into different residential areas. Blacks were divided into 10 so-called homelands based on tribal groups. Homelands were rural, overcrowded, and lacked jobs, forcing blacks to seek work as migrant laborers. Wages were low, and it was illegal for workers to strike. See, apartheid was also economically motivated. A cheap workforce was needed particularly to work in the country's gold mines. Powerful mining magnates had a huge stake in apartheid policies since their profits depended on keeping black wages low. Outside their designated homelands, non-whites had no political rights. Since they were not technically citizens, they couldn't vote. Education? Also divided. The state set up a separate education system for blacks that received a fraction of the funding that white schools did. Mandatory education ended at age 13 and was structured to funnel blacks into menial migrant labor. Exploitation? By design. Needless to say, there was resistance to these insane laws. Protests were often led by black students and youth and were met with severe repression. Out of these struggles came leaders like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, who would help bring an eventual end to apartheid.
Rolihlahla, shaker of trees. He became Nelson Mandela and shook the world.
And we want peace, standing on our feet, not kneeling on our knees.
We know him as the peacemaker, the president of a new South Africa. Now, at the time of his passing, Frontline tells the intimate and surprising story of a Mandela few people know, a bomb-throwing revolutionary who became a skilled politician in prison, a passionate man who sacrificed the love of his life for a country that needed him more. This is the story of a remarkable man of history who united a nation and inspired the world. The Long Walk of Nelson Mandela.
So this was a letter from Sydney Poitier. Wow, what an amazing tribute from such a great American actor. We'll get back to Mr. Poitier in a little bit, but I think maybe we can begin our conversation. Is that okay, Dr. Keshavji? So you came to South Africa truly at one time, the global epicenter of racism. What made Ismailis go to the southernmost tip of Africa at the end of the 19th century? And what did they encounter when they first arrived?
You know, Lela, this is an interesting question. You know, Africa, yes, we can understand. For all Ismailis who were born in Africa, the story of leaving Gujarat and Kathawar in the 19th century is a known story. I think there was also a farman of Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah who said at that time that leave Kathawar and go to Africa. So a lot of Indians went to Africa. Many people went to different parts of the world. I think for me, what was intriguing was why did Jivan Keshavji, the pioneer of the Ismaili settlement in South Africa, come to South Africa? Why not any other part of Africa? And I think that was the intriguing part for me, which took many years for me to find out. Apparently, it's like the story of all immigration. He lived in a place called Chotila in India. And in a nearby village, in a place called Makada, there was a Memon Sunni Muslim called Haji Qasim Nur Muhammad. And Haji Qasim Nur Muhammad told him, look, there's in the streets of South Africa paved with gold, let's go there. We're going to become rich, we're going to make a lot of money, we're going to come back, we're going to be big. And so he jumped on the boat, only to realize that the country he thought it wasn't. But he couldn't go back. And that's when he came. And when he arrived in 1894, unbeknownst to him, about a few months earlier, a Gujarati lawyer had already come to South Africa called Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And Gandhi was already beaten, thrown off the train, and he was in the process of starting the first political party in Africa, or the oldest political party in Africa, the Natal Indian Congress. And around 1908, 1909, his path met with Gandhi, but it was not until 1910, 1911 that Gandhi got in contact with Jivan Keshavji, and that's at the school, the second photograph, where Mahatma Gandhi started a school at Tolstoy Farm. And him and a Jewish architect, Hermann Kallenbach, wanted students from fee-paying families. And my uncle, my granduncle and his family were business people. So they sent this little boy called Rajab Ali Velshi, the third photograph, and that's an outfit that Mahatma Gandhi helped him to stitch. And he is the grandfather of Ali Velshi. In the fourth picture, getting a rubber bullet on him, trying to cover the George Floyd in Minnesota. So it's about a 108-year story of a struggle with racism. So that's a story of the Ismailis in South Africa over a 100-year period. And it was the period in which racial discrimination morphed into apartheid, as we know it.
Yes, absolutely. So let's talk about your book. Your book mentions two icons in the struggle for freedom, Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, both perceived by millions as moral giants, and yet by some as flawed mortals. What do you feel was their contribution to the fight against racism in Africa and elsewhere? And let's talk a little bit about the Jamaat's connection with them. Are there any anecdotes that come to mind? Gandhi's letter, for example, which appears in your book.
You know, Leila, I think that Gandhi's contribution, first of all, was phenomenal. I think what he did when he came in 1894, when he was thrown out of the train, as you saw a minute ago, Gandhi had a choice. He had a choice to go back. Unlike Jivan Keshavji, Gandhi was a barrister. But there was a Damascene moment in the middle of the night when he was shivering on the platform of the station in Pietermaritzburg. Gandhi made a decision. He said, I'm going to remain. I'm going to fight this blight. And Gandhi was responsible for mobilizational politics. In 1894, he managed to get 10,000 Indians to sign a petition against the British government about the conditions of the Indians in South Africa. You know, before the Ismailis arrived in 1894, in 1860, there was a first wave of immigrants who were indentured laborers, and they were in slavery. They were treated very, very badly. So Gandhi started mobilization politics. Gandhi started not only non-violence, he started the whole movement in South Africa called Satyagraha, which means soul force, soul truth. That was the main facet that made his contribution so phenomenal. Now, what was his contribution? Well, Julius Nyerere was a Gandhian follower. He was known as the Gandhi of Africa. Kenneth Kaunda said that Gandhi's philosophy was not good only for Africa at the time of transition, but also throughout. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana in 1957, spoke about the value of Gandhi's philosophy. And I think Martin Luther King said it beautifully when he said that Gandhi's philosophy is the only morally and practically sound method open to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. And interestingly enough, that when John Lewis died, who died recently, he spoke about the notion of forgiveness. He spoke about the notion of nonviolence. He spoke about the whole question of social engagement. And he spoke about social issues that affect all people beyond race. He said, we are all made in the image of God. I mean, this was directly out of Gandhi's philosophy via Martin Luther King. Now, as far as Mandela is concerned, Mandela was a great, great specialist of brilliant man on the art of inclusivity, transformative politics, forgiveness, and inclusivity. I mean, look at the anthem of South Africa. Look at the flag of South Africa. Look at the sports of South Africa. South Africa is not a perfect country, but after 350 years, Mandela was able to forgive. I think it's not easy to do that. And Mandela's impact on the freedom movements of Africa was this longest serving political prisoner coming out of jail, looking at his cell and looking at his cell and talking to his cell. He spoke to the cell in which he was for 10,000 days. And he said, I don't want to remain there anymore. He said, if they take my body away, but if they don't take I don't liberate my mind, I'll remain in it. And he said, I can only do it by forgiving. And you're talking about anecdotes. Yes, in my book, I have a lovely letter from Mahatma Gandhi to my granduncle because they were in communication, I think at least about 20 to 25 times in 1912. But I have a much beautiful story of Mandela. And incidentally, you're saying, what was the connection? Well, the Jamaat connection with Gandhi over the school. But with Mandela, I have a cousin called Ramtullah Welshi, who was Rajabali Welshi's eldest son. And in 1952, he went to prison when Mandela called the Defiance Campaign in 1952. Ramtullah was one of the persons who actually marched with Mahatma Gandhi's son, Manilal Gandhi. So the connection was there. But the important thing about Mandela is an anecdote that brought tears to my eyes when I heard it, that just after he became the president of South Africa, terribly busy man, organizing the transition of this massive, massive machine. And there was a little girl called Michelle Brits, 12-year-old girl. She came from a very Afrikaner, strong, racist background in Pretoria. And when she was dying of leukemia, her parents said, Michelle, what do you want as your last wish? She said, I want to take a picture with Mr. Mandela. They were a poor family. They could have never afforded it. Somehow the message went to Mr. Mandela in Cape Town, 1,000 miles away. Ahmed Kathrada told this to Nelson Mandela. Mandela heard the story and he asked Mr. Kathrada, he said, Ahmed, how old is this child and how long has she got to live? He said, she's only got 6 weeks. Mr. Mandela, one of the busiest presidents in the world, tells Ahmed Kathrada, Ahmed, she cannot travel here. He says, tell the family, I will come and see her. And what does he do? He buys a whole lot of toys and he takes it all the way to her in Pretoria in a military helicopter. He goes to her bedside, takes a photo with her, and there's tears down his eyes and tears down her eyes. He hugs her and he tells her how privileged he is to have a little girl like her in the new South Africa that he is building. And as Ahmed Kathrada says so beautifully, he says all the speeches in the world would mean nothing as much as that one moment when this little girl has captured the heart of this president. So there are beautiful stories of the struggle that have taught what it means to be human.
So if we move on and we think about the Indian community, right? Indians are seen as a commercial community adverse to political engagement, but only bent on making money. So how true is this evaluation with regards to Africa? Did they play any role in the process of political emancipation? I believe there's a wonderful, heartwarming story about a famous Sari. Can you tell us a little bit more about this Sari and who was Mrs. Pillay?
Well, let's go to the narrative first, Lala. You know, unfortunately, that picture of stereotyping the Indians is part of the colonial narrative. I mean, if one studies the history of Africa, this is just so obvious that one doesn't talk about it. Unfortunately, that narrative morphs into a narrative of post-colonial rhetorical discourse in Africa. So sadly, Indians was very, very much put in a very difficult situation in Africa. But I think a 40-minute presentation is not enough to discuss that discourse. But let us look at this gallery. In the extreme left, you see Judge R.K. Khan. Rahim Karim Khan was the son of a secretary of Imam Sultan Mahmud Shah. Rahim Karim Khan actually worked with Mahatma Gandhi in 1894. And they were the founders of the Natal Indian Congress, the oldest political party in Africa. Here's an Ismaili. In the middle, we have Mamdali Karim Chagla. Chagla was a leading jurist, foreign minister of India, education minister of India, judge of the International Court of Justice. Well, in 1947, when the Indian government in waiting, Jawaharlal Nehru, took the case of apartheid to the United Nations, which had just been formed, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, Nehru's sister, led the delegation. Mamdali Karim Chagla was the chief jurist in the delegation, an absolutely brilliant man, and Gandhi gave him full recognition for the work he had done. On the extreme left, right, you see a picture of a person called Ismail Keshavji. The year was 1947, a young Ismaili, he went to prison. He went to prison for hard labor for 1 month because he was part of the passive resistance movement fighting racism. On the second line, you got Mr. Ahmed Kathrada, 26 years in jail, the longest serving political prisoner in South Africa after Nelson Mandela. And when he came out, when somebody told Mr. Kathrada, what did you expect in return? He said, nothing. I wanted a country with freedom. He said, but didn't you want a big position and everything in the government? He said, that's not what I did it for. And then on the extreme right, you have Justice Ismail Mamad, a brilliant judge who was the founder, who wrote the Constitution of Namibia, first Chief Justice of Namibia, first Chief Justice of multiracial South Africa. And I'll speak more about him a little later when we come to the next slide. Incidentally, his brother, a very dear friend of mine, passed away this morning in South Africa. Such a family that gave their heart to the political development. But right at the bottom, you see Mr. Mandela hugging a woman called Mrs. Pillay. Mrs. Pillay was our neighbor. Her daughter went to school with my sister Mila. And Mrs. Pillay, in 1956 to 1960, a one-man band cooked for 156 people who were accused of treason trials. They were unfairly accused on drummed up charges. Mrs. Pillay went from home to home and picked up food and cooked for 156 people for 4 years. She was harassed by the police. Her children were picked up, they were beaten. But Mrs. Pillay did this single-handedly. When the treason trial program was over, Mr. Mandela ordered a sari for her from India in the colors of green, yellow, and black, colors of the African National Congress. She was given that sari. She wore it only once. Then Mr. Mandela, Mr. Kathrada, Walter Sisulu, all of them went to prison for 26, 27 years. Mrs. Pillay put the sari away in a cupboard. She wore it the day Mr. Mandela was released. And that's Mr. Mandela hugging her. When Mrs. Pillay died, they put the sari on a coffin. And when we had a family of South African people's reunion in 2009 in Toronto, they gave me the sari for that event. And it was that 2 meters of cloth that said the history of modern South Africa. And that was the Indian contribution in South Africa. And these are not all the people. There were people like Dr. Dadu. There was Maulvi Kachalia. There were Muslim women. Amina Kachalia, Fatima Mir, Zainab Aswat. These were Muslim women. Freni Jinwala was a Parsi woman. Mrs. Pillay. There were a lot of people who participated in the freedom movement, who went to prison, who were killed, who were thrown out of windows. But these are the people who contributed to what we see today, a non-racial South Africa.
So many stories, so many stories. Your book speaks about practical action to fight racism. Can you give us an idea about what life was like during the apartheid era? You mentioned Ismail Muhammad in your book. Can you explain a little bit more about who he was? And one area where your family was active was in the cinema business. How did racism affect you in that area of work? Your family also met Black actors and musical performers such as Miriam Makeba, the legendary singer, and Sidney Poitier, the famous American actor.
Yes, this is a very interesting story. On the extreme left, I've got a bakery called ABC Bakery. That's not how it looked when it was broken down. That was how it looked when my uncle bought it in 1925. But it became the 11th most modern bakery in the country. In 1951, 52, Walter Sisulu used to come there every Saturday morning to meet Ramtullah, who used to help him in his political mobilization. And then my uncle had to go through all sorts of problems, harassment, you know, they'd raid his bakery, they'd take the staff away, all sorts of horrible things. But let me give you two very stark examples. We have two graduates there. Both of them are doctors. They were the first doctors in the Ismaili community. And here is something close to home. Dr. Hussain Keshavji was at Witwatersrand University in 1945, 46. And he related to me a story that in the anatomy class, when they brought in a cadaver that was of a white body, all the non-whites had to walk out of the class. They couldn't sit there. There was a law that said non-whites could not see the body of a white person. So these are the conditions under which our doctors had to train. Can you believe anything as ludicrous as that? So Dr. Hussain went through that. But after he qualified, Hussain worked in a ghetto, Alexandra Township, where he spent all his working life in South Africa. And there are Africans today who remember that he would give them medicines, people who were beaten by the police, people who were shot by the apartheid police, people who were victims of crime would come to his surgery, and Hussain would look after them. He said sometimes, I didn't know when to start. People were malnutritioned. They were living under such difficult conditions. The second example of our life is I had a cousin who was involved in an accident. And the opposite person was a white person who died. My cousin was injured in this car with two other people. When the ambulance came, they took the body of the dead person to hospital, but they wouldn't take the three non-whites because they were non-whites. And so a white man who saw the car belonging to our family insisted that the ambulance driver pick this person up. And they then took him to the hospital. But his mother got a message that he had died, and his mother then got a heart attack, and she only lived for 2 more months. Now that's the sister of the doctor, Dr. Dolly Keshavji, who then spent all her life helping in the ghetto, all people who were underprivileged. So this was the contribution. Then we had somebody else called Nuru Dada who left, who got married and went to Kenya. And Nuru Ben, as we called her, spent her entire life in a ghetto in the slums, working for Red Cross. And I never saw her in civilian clothes. She always was dressed in a Red Cross outfit all my life that I knew her for 30 or 35 years. So that civic consciousness came in quite early, that we need to contribute some way that we can. Now the cinema is interesting. That belonged to an uncle of mine called Habib. And Miriam Makeba in 1947 was, I think, only about 15 or 16 years old. And she had sang when Princess Elizabeth, who's the present queen, came to South Africa. Now, Miriam Makeba used to come and sing at the cinema. And my uncle used to give her the stage every Friday evening to sing her songs. And he would then give her some money, some pocket money, so she could feed the family. Africans had no place where they could go and sing. Africans had no place where they could express their talent. And when Miriam Makeba sang Pata Pata many years later, she took it to Gallo Africa to get the record published and printed. You know what they gave her? Royalty, 50 shillings, which is less than $1. And eventually that song made it worldwide. Now, as far as Sidney Poitier is concerned, Poitier came there in 1950 to film Cry the Beloved Country, one of the epics on apartheid, on racial discrimination. It was his very, very few first films. And he was invited to come to the cinema to speak with Canada Lee, a leading black actor from America. And Canada Lee stood out and told the audience, "You will be free, you shall be free." And this is where Sidney Poitier came to our home, came to my uncle's home. And you know, Sidney Poitier has done great films. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? You know, films like A Patch of Blue, The Defiant Ones, Blackboard Jungle. A great filmmaker. He also did Something of Value. All his films have a theme of racism. And Poitier was visibly disturbed from what he saw because he became a victim of the very part he was playing in the film. He actually saw apartheid in front. He was actually given the same treatment of the film he was doing. And this is why Mrs. Kabani and I were conspiring to get him to the Seattle book launch, but he was not too well to be able to come. But gracious enough, so beautifully, to send that letter. And he said he really thoroughly enjoyed the book very much because it brought memories back to him of his own life. So that was the apartheid piece that we saw happening.
I think these are really amazing stories. One thing that your book mentions is a man named Zombo who was beaten mercilessly by the police. And this was in 1960. Given the climate of the world right now, you saw these things very, very often as a teenager in South Africa, am I correct? I mean, were you aware of what was happening around you at the time, and how did this make you feel?
You know, Lela, as a young boy, I was very interested in politics. I read a lot. I came from a family where we read a lot, and we always discussed every day over the eating table. And we lived behind one of the cinemas. And I think this was probably, excuse me, 1958, 59. And I remember that a person called Colin Legham had written an article in one of the newspapers about the All Africa conference that was held in Accra in 1958. Kwame Nkrumah had just become the president of Ghana and invited some outstanding Africans to come there. And a trade union leader from Kenya called Tom Mboya was asked to chair the conference, the Accra conference. And there was a map in the newspaper of Africa and how the countries were all going to get freedom in the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And I thought to myself, wow, are Africans going to be ruling their own country, their own destiny? I couldn't believe it. And then one day I'm walking in the street and I see a commotion. And there, a white policeman in a big truck, they break the door open of the cinema because it was locked, and they pick up this African guy and they start beating him mercilessly. And they picked him up, they beat him, and they took him and they threw him right into the truck from about 3 or 4 meters. And I thought to myself, am I dreaming? Am I imagining? Is this true? Is what I read in the newspaper true in what is happening in the rest of Africa and what's happening in South Africa? But sadly, that was the hubris, the arrogance of power, if you may call it, that apartheid had engendered. And you know, 1960, Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of Britain had said in the Parliament of South Africa, in Cape Town, that a wind of change is blowing over Africa, whether we like it or not, it's a matter of fact. But the situation is that even as late as 1960, this was the type of problem we were seeing. And you see at the bottom, Joseph Sifuma was a person who worked with us. I grew up with him. I mean, he was my moral compass. And he used to always tell me, one day is one day, God is watching. And I met him 40 years later, and I asked him, has that one day arrived? So these are the type of difficulties that were engendered in this type of problem that we saw every day of our life. You know, we had to look for strength from our faith, basically. It was, where else could you go?
True.
So it was very, how did I feel? I felt very bad, but it intensified my resolve to become a lawyer. I said, if Mandela is a lawyer, and Gandhi was a lawyer, and Ismail Mahmoud's a lawyer, perhaps, even if I may not get a chance of getting into law school, I could aspire. And as it transpired, I was very fortunate to be able to go to law school in England, but I don't think I would have made it in South Africa because of the color of my skin.
Thank you for that, Dr. Kishabji. East Africa, let's move a little bit up and east. East Africa also had a kind of racism. What role did Indians play, and more particularly some Ismailis, in dealing with the issues in East Africa?
Well, East Africa is a very interesting situation. I mean, racism in East Africa, thank God, was not as rugged and as crude as it was in South Africa, but it was there. Nonetheless, it was there. It was bad. I mean, I'm talking as an Indian. If you spoke to an African and he told you what they had faced, I mean, it's staggering. I mean, I was very fortunate. A colleague of mine recently sent me a clip about the Mau Mau period and what people like Evelyn Baring had done, and that the type of duplicity that the British government had perpetrated. But what is fascinating, and I'm so happy that I learned so much more, that one of the founders of the movement in East Africa was Suleiman Virji, an Ismaili, Suleiman Hussein Virji. He started what turned to become the East African Indian Congress. And I think I'm going to use just a few moments in each one of this to be able to do justice, just to speak about the seminal contribution of people in this particular pantheon. Suleiman Virji, as early as 1919, went to Britain. It went to India to plead the case of the Asians and the Africans to be able to own property in the White Highlands. And in the presence of the Secretary of State, Lord Chelmsford, he spoke about, he actually said in the meeting that the whites will have to leave Africa, Kenya, but we Indians will still be here and will be doing business. And so when he came back, he was charged for contempt of court. And the judge, Justice Sheridan, said, treat him properly as a guest of the government because he hasn't done anything wrong. He hasn't committed a crime. And in a case after that, when the same judge told Hussein Suleiman Virji that you have to pay the poll tax, he refused to pay it because it was racist. And the judge said, I'll pay it for you, but so that you don't go to prison. And we know what Virji said, I don't need your charity. I actually give charity. I mean, he was a firebrand. And he, in 1926, got Sarojini Naidu, when she came to Kenya, he gave her the position to be the second president of the East African Indian Congress. Now, what is the seminal part of Virji is what I want to say to you now. In 1923, there was a delegation that went to Britain, and that had Ali Bhai Mullah Jivanji was a Bora, and there were other people like Manilal Desai, and this whole delegation went. And it was this delegation that Hussein Suleiman Virji led that forestalled the whites from declaring Kenya a white colony, because African paramountcy became the main Devonshire Declaration, which the Indians were responsible for ensuring until African nationalism was ready to take over. So Virji was also a great mentor to Harry Thuku, an African nationalist. Then you had Ali Bhai Mullah Jibanji, did a lot of work, great philanthropist. He was part of that whole pantheon. There was a person like Manilal Desai, Manilal Ambalal Desai, and I think Suleiman Virji actually paid to employ him to do this work. Then there was a person like Pio Pinto, a Goan, who went to prison with Kenyatta, and he met Malcolm X. I think they were assassinated in the same year. Then coming down to seminal contributions by Ismailis. There's Bahadur Ali Qasim Suleiman Virji. I can't see his picture here, but I think it probably is blocking me, but no problem. BKS Virji, Count Bahadur Ali Qasim Suleiman Virji, in the Legislative Council, when they were still debating whether there would be separate rights for the Indians, BKS Virji said, we're all Africans. We are brown Africans. And that was a time in the Legislative Council where Africans didn't have much of a voice, and the whites wouldn't bring this up. But BKS Virji spoke about this. And he was part of the constitutional delegation that went to Lancaster House Conference with Dr. Obote. Then you go to Kenya, for example. Sorry about that. Before I forget about BKS Virji, in March 1960, when people were killed in Sharpeville, Bahadur Ali Qasim Suleiman Virji actually tabled in the Legislative Council, condemning that act. And today, 20th of March, is World Racism Day. It was an Ismaili who tabled that in the Legislative Council of Uganda. Closer to Kenya, you have Count Ibrahim Natu, who's in the middle of the picture. Count Ibrahim Natu, a great educationist. He was the colonial minister of works, right, from I think 1954 to 1961. When he came back to Kenya in February 1960, he got up at the city council, he gave a speech, and he said, we will throw our lot in with the Africans. By doing so, he precipitated Kenya's independence. Now here is a man who's not been very much researched, but remarkable contribution he made. Then you can see in the extreme left, you got Amir Jamal. This is the Amir Jamal of Tanzania. And he, interestingly, was a victim of a racist clause in the constitution of the Tanganyika African National Union Party. And Julius Nyerere fought to change that, not realizing that he was going to get one of the strongest and most loyal ally, who became then later on a finance minister in Tanzania. And Amir Jamal actually played a major role in international trade and free flow of information, where racism was also very, very embedded. And Jamal died very recently, but a very, very leading thinker. Then you have Nick Qasim, a dear friend of mine, but Nick was again a young ambassador. He was ambassador to UNESCO in 1962, and then he became an ambassador to United Nations. And here was a man, when Nick was asked by U Thant that why didn't you stay over? There's a big position for you in the United Nations. And Nyerere called for Nick. Nick said, look, my country's calling me, I've got to go back. And Nick came back and spent the next 30 years or so in Tanzania, played a major role in the Williamson Diamond Mines. He played a major role as an environment minister, Minister of Communications, Nyerere's minister to the East African community. Then there was Zanzibar, early days, 1938, Diwan Jindani, who told the Sultan, treat your people with compassion of all colors, because you need them. If you want them to perform your polity, you've got to be kind to them. So there was Husseini Balu went to prison during the revolution at that time. Mozambique, person who died with Somera Marshall in the plane crash was his leading advisor, a chap called Murad Mahmoud Hussein Alibai. And then Comoros, Abdul Rasul Khalfan, a leading philanthropist. When he died, there was a public holiday that day. So these were people in Eastern Africa, in the islands of East Africa, in Madagascar, in Reunion. These were people, these were Asians, and there were quite a sizable lot of Ismailis who played a role there. So importantly, they played a role.
Yes. So you talked about the political context. Outside of the political context, there was also social action. And can you tell us a little bit more about this photograph over here?
Yeah, both these photographs are in my book, and they have a great resonance in our family's narratives. The first photograph is interesting. That's 25th of December, 1952. You know, Kenyatta's defense team was 7 lawyers, out of which I think 4 were Indians. Achru Ram Kapila, Jaswant Singh, Fitz D'Souza, and I think Divan Chamanlal, the man who's right at the extreme left of that photo. Then there's D.N. Pritt, right in the middle, was the former Attorney General of Britain. And I think there was a Nigerian called H.O. Davis, and there was a Jamaican called Dudley Thompson. Now, on the 25th of December, 1952, the defense team won a preliminary point in court. And it was where the junior, Kapila, defended the senior, because the senior was charged for contempt of court. So it was a day of jubilation. But what? They couldn't find a place to have a cup of coffee because they couldn't sit together. They were people of different colors. So they came to Nairobi and they met my uncle Habib. And they said, Habib, we were celebrating today, but we didn't know where to go. So my uncle said, look, come to my home. I've got a party. And there was a beautiful barbecue and he invited them. And what happened? That photo somehow got into the special branch of South Africa and they canceled passports of some members of our family. It was then Upper Pant from the Indian embassy who gave them Indian passports. On the extreme right, it's my uncle meeting Kenyatta. And when Kenya got its independence, he went to meet Kenyatta in the first few days. And Kenyatta remembered, he said, Habib, you had sent me a little fridge when I was in incarceration for my food. And he said, you sent me vitamin tablets. He says, thank you. You kept me alive. But it's those type of dimensions of our relationship in Africa that we carried with us in the struggle for social justice that took place. And I'm sure people have tremendous stories of what happened and beautiful, beautiful memories, because Africa is a beautiful continent. The people are wonderful. I mean, they have what we need to learn. They have Ubuntu, the whole notion of humanity.
I want to talk a little bit about Maulana Hazrat Imam and the role that he played in contributing to nation building in East Africa. What memories do you have of this time?
You know, I have beautiful memories. I just come into Kenya at that time in 1962, and Maulana Hazrat Imam used to come almost every year to Nairobi. And we just waited. It was just those beautiful days. And every time Hazrat Imam came, it was like a jubilation for us. But in this picture, you can see Hazrat Imam with Jomo Kenyatta, Hazrat Imam with President Nyerere, and the other picture of Hazrat Imam in Pretoria. Hazrat Imam's contribution was at various levels. Hazrat Imam set up the first newspaper there that represented African sentiments. A newspaper for Africans, by Africans, run by Africans, articulating the African viewpoint. That was what the nation was. And I think Hazrat Imam responded to a plea by Tom Mboya, who was a very leading man, became a very leading member in the Kenya Parliament after that. So Hazrat Imam contributed towards the development of a press, a free press in East Africa. Then the schools, Hazrat Imam built outstanding schools, and I'd mentioned BKS Virji, Ibrahim Nattu, I'd mentioned Nick Kassam, there was also Jimmy Virji, there was Pyarli Pirani. These were all administrators of education, setting up beautiful schools. And if I may quote, on the 10th of December 1961, Hazrat Imam at the school said, if Muhammad, and I don't think he meant me, if Muhammad, Jonathan and Joroge can take the school certificate together and play football together, the chances are they would get to know and understand each other far better than their parents were able to do so. Now that's in 1961, I'm going back almost 60 years. And where are we now? Look at the picture right at the bottom. 2015, Hazrat Imam has developed the AKU to produce human resources in those parts of the world. You find African doctors, nurses, teachers. linked to the Institute of Education Development in Pakistan and its linkages with international universities. So that is now addressing structural racism at a very fundamental level of wisdom of creating human resources in a knowledge society. So Hazrat Imam's contribution, when you say memories, it was not transitional. It was during the transition as well as before and subsequently. And I think that is a remarkable contribution in my book.
This is amazing. We have it's about 9:50. We have about 10 minutes.
Good. I think we will finish.
Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about a difficult time during history, the Ugandan expulsion, and you were in Kenya at the time. And what are your recollections of those 90 days, which were a horrendous blot on that country's history? We believe that your family was involved in helping an African minister from escaping a murderous squad, one of the murderous squads of Idi Amin. There are many local Ismailis that were involved in helping people find a home. Can you elaborate on these stories?
Yeah, you know, I look back to those days. It's going to be 50 years next year, or 2 years from now. They were horrendous days. They must have been very, very difficult days for people who were asked to leave. And I recall I was a lawyer in Nairobi. I was part of a team that was trying to look at many of these people's immigration problems. There were many local Ismailis, too many to mention. I can think of people like, one of them was a chap called Nurali Ibrahim, another person was called Mitubai. These people every evening used to go to the airport to take sandwiches to people, to help people, to get them out of problems. And there were many others. I mean, there were myriad people doing a lot of work. So when I look back 50 years, I say, wow, from where to where we've come. It was very difficult days. I think it created what I think Hazrat Imam had mentioned, that it created a psychosis of fear in East Africa with everybody. Interestingly enough, just last week, the man who actually worked this whole program, Roger St. Vincent, who Pierre Trudeau had sent to Uganda, died just last week. And I think that his book describes this, I don't know what his book is called, it's on the website, but he describes those 90 days as they unfolded. For me, there's a fascinating story. It was ironic, it was filled with irony, because we were a family, we were in business, but we didn't have our citizenship. And one morning a man knocked our door, and it happened to be an African with a cap on, and my mother opened the door not realizing who it was. It happened to be a former Attorney General of Uganda, a former education minister called Dr. Zaki, who ended up at our home. And the irony is so interesting that my elder brother Amir and my younger brother Sadat helped to get him out of the country. So we were looking for a passport for a black man being thrown out by a country with a black dictator. So you can see racism has so many different dimensions. And Dr. Zaki eventually made it to America. We were very happy that his family was safe. We managed to get them all out. And a few years later, he became Uganda's ambassador to Washington after all that. So the vicissitudes of fortune were, nothing in life is permanent, but it was a difficult time.
Nothing in life is permanent. That's true. So here, at a very personal level, you have been a recipient of the highest civilian peace award in the USA. You were invited to give the memorial lecture at Martin Luther King's 48th death anniversary. This must have been a very emotional moment for you. Could you tell us a little bit about how you felt? And people like King, Gandhi, Mandela, and Ikeda are your icons. You must have experienced, in Poitier's word, a profound feeling of triumph of the spirit.
Yes, you know, Leila, this is a very special day. It was filled with a lot of emotions for me. I can think of it at quite a few levels. First of all, it was a very spiritual day because we were celebrating the 48th anniversary of a very, very great man. MLK was a very, very great man. So there was sort of a spiritual resonance around, which was very beautiful. But what was more touching is that as I was sitting on the podium, there was an African-American child, an African boy playing the violin. And he had just got entrance into Harvard School of Divinity. And my mind went back to South Africa, and I thought about the Bantu Education Act that would not have allowed that child to even go beyond primary school. And here he was going to Harvard, and he was playing a piece saying, "Oh my Lord, what I am in life, I owe to you." A beautiful piece on the violin. So my African heritage kicked in. And then I thought of Mahatma Gandhi and the association that the Indians had with him. So my Indian background came in. And then as I looked into the audience, there were members of the Jamaat who had come there. The president, the then president of the council, Dr. Barkat Fazil, flew in specially for the event. There was an ex-president, Habib Jamal, who finished all his work in his surgery. He's a surgeon, came for the evening. And there were members of the Jamaat. I mean, it just connected me. My multiple identities all came together in one frame beautifully. There was Asia, there was Africa, there was North America. And then there was my own community connection. And I said, wow, they all fit in so beautifully. They don't conflict with each other. But it was a very moving moment, which I think brought back a lot of resonances that how do I define myself? It was for me a defining moment, but a very moving one. And I thought of the education vision of Hazrat Imam that had given me and so many of us that opportunity to be able to participate in a vision which is not uni prismal. It's not uni lenses. We can look at things from so many different perspectives. I think that is very enriching.
So I have one more question for you before we move on to take some questions from our audience. And the question is, might this be a global tipping point, or is this the beginning of a protracted struggle that will remain with us beyond this pandemic? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
You know, Leila, we see so many images of such social inequities. We saw one in Minnesota recently. A few years ago, we saw one on the shores of the Mediterranean, Bodrum, where a little boy, 3-year-old child, had drowned from one of those boats that were not even seaworthy. Earlier, we saw the self-immolation person burning in Tunis, in Sidi Boussaid. It was a person called Mohammed Bouazizi. These are dramatic moments. They're catalytic. They do rattle the international conscience and the international consciousness. I use both the words, international conscience and consciousness. And they create what Paulo Freire calls conscientization. You know, a critical consciousness of social issues. And I can see their value. But racism is so structurally embedded in all the social systems that we have today. I think more than racism in isolation, we need to study the pathology of social injustice. It's very deeply rooted. And if we do a root cause analysis and try and understand the causes of this pathogen, for which we don't have a vaccine yet, but I think we need to look at the pathology of social injustice and see how we can address this one little chip at a time. Now, will this happen? I sure hope it does. Should it happen? Of course, if it doesn't happen, what type of a society will we be in? And I think the present pandemic has given us a pause button to reflect, to analyze, to think, and to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be human in the 21st century? I think it takes a lot of reflection.
Thank you, Dr. Kushavji. That was beautiful. It was beautifully put and a wonderful way to end the structured portion of our presentation. If it's okay, I have some questions from the audience. I don't know if we'll have time for too many, but let's say we try to hit 2 or 3. What do you think?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, so one of the questions that kind of came out was, in dealing with the current situation in the United States, how do we incorporate our faith into the decisions we make regarding how we approach and address racism and inequity? You know, what do you think about this?
Well, I would probably can only speak for myself because I've lived through racism for many years and I've also worked with the structure of the community. You know, we live in communities where we see social inequities, and this is not on a racial cleavage. I mean, there's inequities today in many parts of the world. When we look at police brutality, I think we live in countries where we can participate in democratic processes. We are able to vote. We are able to be conscious about the issues, the social issues. And I think I don't need anybody to advise me or to tell me that to go and help some old person in my road, to help somebody who's a victim of intergenerational injustice. I don't need anybody to tell me that I should be more environmental conscious. But I think we need to participate in the processes of government, to vote conscientiously, to become civically conscious, to get involved in school boards, get involved in food banks, get involved in doing little things for people and do things for people. There are enough civil society institutions everywhere, starting from my road here in Ashton Road. Down the road, there are people here saying, do you need your medicines? We'll go and pick them up for you. These are not whites, browns, blacks, they're everybody, they're human beings. And I think that we in the Jamaat can do a lot, but we can do it at every level. And Hazrat Imam has given us guidance to remember compassion, to act with fairness, to remember the ethics of our faith. And I don't see any clash between the ethics of our faith and my ability in the world I live in to do something for those who are less fortunate to me. I think it's incumbent on me. To me, it's part of my faith. If I didn't do it, I think I would not be living my faith. I can't say I'm perfect, but certainly if I help anybody and look at this on a needs-blind basis as my little contribution to doing something, I think that in my book, I'm living my faith. And I think people live their faith at different levels, and different people live their faiths at different levels, and people of non-faith also do contribute to human betterment. So
Thank you.
I would think the field is open.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much. So I have another question. How can we can you comment on the differences in systematic oppression between Indians and Black South Africans? How were Indians treated compared to Black South Africans by the colonizers?
Yes, that's a good question. Basically, South Africa had a four-partite categorization. Either you were white, or you were black, or you were brown, or you were colored. Very odd sort of categorization. So black as a term was not non-white. It was a separation of races and then people being given separate amenities according to the color of the skin. So Indians in South Africa were treated better than the blacks, but not as good as the whites, and perhaps somewhat little bit different from the colors. That was the South African government's policy of racial categorization. But to the credit of people like Dr. Dadu, who I mentioned earlier, Dr. Naika, who was another doctor from Edinburgh, who was the head of the Natal Indian Congress, and the third person I think was at that time, I can't remember the name of the African National Congress. I think it was Dr. Tsele in 1948 or Dr. Morocca, I can't remember. The three races got together and they said, the Indians and Africans got together in 1949, 1950. And they said, look, we're all being disadvantaged by the same devastating, degrading treatment. We cannot accept separate treatment. We have to take this racism out of society. And that is where the Indians and the Africans made a pact to work together. Mr. Kafrara was an Indian. He went to prison, 26 years. The first day, he refused to wear a long pair of pants because they said, why are you giving me a long pair of pants? And Mr. Mandela has to wear a short pair of pants. He said, I'm going on strike. He would not have the same, he was given slightly better food, he refused it. He said, I will eat what the blacks eat. But this is what the Indians were able to do through their leaders who were very powerful. That doesn't mean there were some Indians who didn't want to go the way with the whites, but by and large, the Indians threw their lot in with the blacks.
So it's really interesting. Eleanor Roosevelt says, you know, human rights begin in the small places, just as you had mentioned before, in our neighborhoods, in our schools. So I have a question from the audience. How can we as individuals address discrimination, the discrimination that exists within our own local communities? What sort of responsibility do we have here?
I think any sort of intervention, I remember in my citation at the Martin Luther King Award, I remember Dean Carter mentioning Gandhi, King, and Ikeda. And he said their social activism was underpinned by deep philosophical and moral reflection. I think we need to reflect over issues, but we shouldn't be paralyzed by reflection. We should be acting as well. But let's say little things we can do. You know, sometimes people are marginalized because they can't get into schools because they don't know how to write essays. Sometimes people are marginalized because they may not have that little money to go forward to do something because of the color of the skin. It may not only be the color of the skin, it may be because of poverty. I think what we need to do is wherever we are, if we see social injustice, and with a little bit of push, if you can do something for somebody, do it for somebody. The Reverend Jesse White, when I met him, he was talking about Thanksgiving, and he mentioned that how the Ismailis were helping to take food to the disadvantaged people. And there were few individuals he mentioned. He said, without them, I can't operate. So here we are, we can do a lot. We can do a lot at an underprivileged level. I think of Alberta, the new lieutenant governor who's coming on, Salma Lakhani. She took me to a school for my book launch. And here I remember she was doing work for underprivileged people for 30 years. I don't think that she was looking for a position. And I remember the headmaster of the school saying, if Salma wasn't there, I do not know what our children would do. But in every area we live in, there's going to be a disadvantaged school. There's going to be a disadvantaged child. There may be a child who's probably autistic. There may be an old person who cannot get their groceries done. There may be somebody who wants to improve their chances in life through education. There may be somebody who wants a CV done. There may be somebody who's looking for little money to be able to take the child for a program somewhere. Little things mean a lot.
Okay, so we have one last question, and this is directed towards you and your experience. So I'm really excited to ask this and hear what you have to say. It's amazing how you have combined an excellent education with a career in public service. What is your advice for a thinking career of public service? And thinking is in quotes.
Yes, lovely question. I had grown up to want to be a lawyer, work for human rights, or I even wanted to be an ambassador at one time. But life always unfolds in very mysterious ways. I think a public career is important. You know, something like public administration at a place like Kennedy School of Government, a place like Fletcher School of Diplomacy in America, a place like London School of Economics. I think what I would do if I had to live my life again, and I don't think I would want it any differently because life has been very kind to me, I think. And I always tell my siblings that through their prayers and my parents, I was very fortunate. I would say that Ismailis can contribute at a very, very important level through education. You know, constitutional development in countries is one area crying for a lot of input. International conscientization in terms of climate, in terms of environmental justice, in terms of bridging the gap between the rich and the poor, like Amir Jamal did with Nyerera's time. There's a lot we can do. And today in a knowledge society, if we have that type of background, we can play an important role. So I would say public administration, areas of concern to human existence, which today for me are areas like environmental justice, areas of looking at law and how law can be allied to the notion of justice, dispute resolution, getting into NGOs that help in conflict, helping in areas of the world where people do not have opportunities, and also working with our own governments to bring about that sort of change through the democratic process, through the institutions in which we get involved. And Ismailis have done that. We've seen mayors in Canada. We've seen individuals in Canada who have headed immigration boards. We've seen individuals who are running major programs at universities. But I think we need to open our horizon to say, look, we have to serve the community, we have to serve the country, but we have to go beyond the community and the country. And we have to make an impact where we can make a lasting impact on societies. And I'm very fortunate that I had the career I had. I wonder what it would have been if it wasn't what I did. But I think that we only have one life and we have so many dreams. So I would say to all our people in the Jamaat, keep on studying, keep on learning every day, and keep on using your education to the betterment of human society. That's the ethics of education. Use your education to further the cause of the human dignity at every level.
Dr. Keshavji, I want to say thank you to you for spending time with us tonight and sharing this wonderful history. It's nuance and the human story that tend to get overlooked in history books. And those small pieces allow us to make decisions that are different than we would had we just read that history book. And I think you spent time today filling in those small little holes that actually change minds and contribute to that nuance. So I truly appreciate the time that you spent talking with me and our Jamaat tonight. And I hope we can do this again. This was really fun and enlightening.
Thank you to you, Lela, and thank you to Aspire. Your programs are very, very beautifully conducted. I want to say how I feel honored that you had invited me to be part of tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would like to just make a quick announcement. Our next interactive critical conversation on social justice in Islam, exploring global poverty. This session is going to take place on Sunday, July 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Central. So we hope to see you soon. And I want to say thank you very much for joining us. And again, thank you to Dr. Keshavji for spending time with us again. And good night and Yali Madat, everybody.